Hello and welcome to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've been considering for quite a while actually, how to deal with inheriting a dysfunctional team. I do a lot of conflict resolution training as part of my business, so I'm doing training in areas like assertiveness skills or de-escalation, etc. And some of the time, the focus is on internal relationships, like a group of managers and team leaders, and equipping them with better communication tools, for example, to deal with their team. And some of the time, I go into an organization, for example, so I'm doing training with a whole group of staff from the same place. In other situations, I might host an event and, I just open it up for individuals to enroll from the local organizations present. Maybe it's around a particular topic or a particular sector. Or I might be working where I'm engaged by an association or something like that, where different practitioners can become members, for example. And I've noticed that in those second groups of training workshops, where I've got a random mix of people from different companies, almost always people start to talk about the challenges that they've faced walking into a situation where there was already problems. There was already conflict and it wasn't being dealt with well. There was already dysfunctional relationships going on, particularly when you're moving into a team leader role and the previous team leader was, a bit of a mess. Well, it can feel like quite a nightmare, to be honest. It's a challenge from every direction, and it can be very easy to feel overwhelmed in those kind of situations because it's not clear what's going on, let alone where you should start in terms of responding. Let's move the microphone up a little bit. So for me, I have a particular challenge when I'm encountering these types of topics during a training workshop, because people talk about, the nightmare in amongst the team members that they're dealing with. And it seems to me like there are probably options that they could use to improve the situation. Realistically, if things have been getting worse over a long period of time, it will probably also be a process of gradual improvement. It won't be a magic wand, press the button and all of a sudden things are suddenly different. Particularly with a larger team, if there's multiple people involved, it can be like a bigger ship and it takes a long time to steer and change direction in the water, the same as if you were trying to do a 180-degree turn in a large ocean liner or something like that. So change is probably going to happen gradually and slowly. And to be perfectly honest, you often don't see the benefits, you don't see the signs of improvement until a significant time has elapsed between when you've started to do something differently, which means that it can be easy to get discouraged because you're thinking that you're making a difference, you're doing things right, you've clarified expectations, you've reviewed this and this, you've discussed expectations, etc., respectful communication, professional communication. You might have even articulated what those things look like. And yet at the beginning, things often still feel really gross, really tense, really stuck. And I think in part that's because of the level of emotion that people are often experiencing. If they've been in what they might perceive as a highly pressurized situation where people are out to get them and so they naturally need to engage in self-protective behaviors, it's a little bit like redlining your car over a long period of time. You burn out. And so probably the people that you're dealing with, at least at the beginning, are a little bit burnt out, which means they're not thinking clearly. They'll be a little bit hypervigilant to any potential signs of threat. Criticism, for example, when you might ask them to consider how they've contributed to a situation. And what often happens is that a well-meaning team leader or manager comes in, they're a little bit supportive at the beginning. They get some type of a negative reaction, back in their face, like they feel like they're trying to make inroads with people and everyone's shut down and defensive, or maybe people are constantly blaming everyone else and not being willing to take on board any responsibility. And so instead of continuing down the supportive, a coaching path, for example, instead they turn to formal mechanisms where they increase the level of what's at stake, like a formal warning or threatening for formal warning or performance management. And then, to be honest, as someone who's done a lot of workplace mediations now for over 10 years, what often happens next is that some people leave. One person decides to quit, they might opt out, they might finally get fired. But gosh, the process leading up to that final moment of change is excruciating for everybody involved, especially when it's drawn out by things like sick leave. And, in some situations, there's a mental health claim that's made and it's covered under workers' compensation insurance. This is all within Australia. The insurance companies are just completely ruining our society at the moment in so many ways. It's just so disgusting. Like the bureaucracy and the level of paperwork and all this kind of stuff, the illogical decisions, the complete neglect for human needs and interests in favor of making money. To me, it seems like a lot of it is actually driven by the underlying insurance policies and companies wanting to protect their own costs. And so they're towing the line and passing on additional work to their staff, for example, because the insurance company tells them that they should. And then the result is that their staff become more frazzled and busy and probably start to feel a bit more burnt out over time. And then what do you know? They're off on a workers' compensation claims and the company's costs go up anyway. I think this false economy of constantly trying to chase after this short-term survival, but I suppose that's the reality of the legislative framework that we're working in at the moment until we can get some better politicians in that will overhaul all of this kind of stuff. Even where I live at the moment, there's constantly a stream at the moment of people having their roofs replaced. Where I live, the houses are reasonably new. They're mostly within 5 or 6 years old. And all of the roofs are getting replaced because it hails here every single year. There's a storm and there's hailstones, and it causes these incredibly small dents in everybody's roof. And then as soon as the hailstorms have finished for the year, there's a knock on everybody's door as all of these roofing companies come around. And a lot of my neighbours are elderly, like people in their 80s. So a roofer comes and knocks on the door and says, I'll replace your roof. There's no cost to you, or it's only the cost of your excess on your insurance. So, it's going to be $800 and you'll get a full new roof. Won't that feel amazing? And so all of these companies come in, they take the cream of the top of the profits of all of this. Then they hire local contractors who are grateful for the work, but of course they don't have any type of security, or they're not seeing the full profit in terms of the work that they're doing. They're getting paid the bare minimum, like quite literally. The company who engages with the client will pay the subcontractor the bare minimum, of course, because they want the work to be done as cheaply as possible. And I suppose arguably this company's job is to make a profit, and this is an opportunity that they can leverage, but we all pay for this. Do you know what I mean? Everybody in the neighborhood is effectively paying for each of these roofs that keep getting replaced every couple of years. And it just boggles my mind at the fact that all of these people around don't seem to appreciate the fact that the system itself is draining the resources that we need. Because then you hear about a housing crisis, for example. And gosh, wouldn't it be nice if instead of allowing these insurance companies to constantly rip everybody off collectively, that we could push back and put some restrictions in place for this kind of stuff? Like, my goodness. Anyway, of course, then as soon as I start to talk about the restrictions, I become much more of a libertarian and I prefer individual freedoms, etc. So as you can probably imagine, I realize that I'm a hypocrite a lot earlier than probably I expected to have to. But that same thing is happening at work. It's these insurance companies driving what I think of as quite unethical decisions. And that is often the way that it plays out at the end of the day. So a team leader comes in, they take a supportive path at the beginning. It doesn't work, or at least they don't see signs that it's working, even if it might be. They instead shift to a more formal adversarial type of process, like warnings, etc., and then usually 1 or 2 people leave. In some situations, everybody sticks around for a number of years, and probably everybody suffers to different levels and causes suffering of everybody else around them during that time as well. And it's this reciprocal pattern where you're probably all spilling out and increasing the pain that everybody else is going through as well. And yet there's this incredible stuckness in these systems and in these relationships when these patterns aren't dealt with. And so what's that old saying? If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've already got. And I've certainly had my fair share of coming in to do a mediation and hearing about the fact that it's been 5 or 6 years of this excruciating situation for everybody involved. So in the podcast today, I'm going to be talking about a number of practical options that you can use for these kind of situations where you inherit a dysfunctional team. Now, first, they can be incredibly stressful experiences to have for you. So self-care will be incredibly important, both to protect yourself longer term. Like, you don't want to walk away and experience something like burnout yourself, or you don't want negative impacts on your other relationships, on your parenting relationships, or with your partner, or whatever else it might be. And even if your goal is to look after other people, you want to be the best person that you can be so that you can look after them as best as you can. So self-care, to me, it's not necessarily even a selfish thing. It's just this fundamental base layer of scaffold that needs to be built if we're going to have any hope of responding versus just reacting in the challenging kind of situations that we often encounter when we're dealing with workplace conflict. So self-care longer term, but then also self-regulation during the short term. It's going to be frustrating. You're going to tell people something and they're not going to listen, and they're probably not thinking logically. So when they start to get worked up and upset about something that's happened, you might need to take a few deep breaths, or wiggle your toes and feel the feeling of your socks in your shoes, or adjust your posture, or pay attention to your senses. Do something that anchors you in the present and gives you back that sense of self-control, regulating your own nervous system, because that is going to be important if you're going to have any hope of thinking clearly, choosing your words carefully, being aware of the consequences of your behavior, etc. So once we've figured out what we need to do in terms of longer-term self-care or short-term self-regulation, the next step a lot of the time is some type of analysis. Now, I particularly like using the 5 types of conflict, and I've talked about that in previous episodes of the podcast, actually. The 5 types of conflict are data, structure, interest, values, and relationship. And this is where we kind of sit back and just take stock of what's going on. A lot of the time, I find it helpful to notice the patterns of interaction between the people who are involved. Are there particular areas of their work or meetings that don't go well, or are there particular people that seem to clash? Is it by email that the conflict is happening, or does it happen with the bitching and whinging about each other behind the scenes? Like, kind of just taking stock of what's going on. So that's the data. And we also want to think about what expectations are currently in place. In other words, how have those expectations been communicated to the staff members previously? What was the previous team member like, etc.? How did these discussions go? And how are they working? Where is that, okay in terms of the level of clarity or the overlap between staff, or the ambiguous areas, etc.? And where is there more clarity needed? That, I think, is often the starting point, is making sure that people know what's expected and telling them that, like repeatedly reinforcing it and rewarding it when they're doing it and considering a negative consequence when they're not. Like, we do need to respond and give feedback, and a part of that will be first making sure that people know what they should be doing. So that's the data point in terms of analyzing the conflict, is what should people be doing, and then what are they doing by comparison. What we want to do is almost observe the gap in the reality of the day-to-day versus the ideal, or what we think should be going on. We could also consider things like structure, like how are decisions made, how does communication happen, how frequently are the meetings held, is there an agenda or is it more open-ended, who provides input, how does that happen, what tends to be the culture around decisions, for example, or input or giving feedback, etc., what tend to be the sticking points. And again, we just step back and take a bird's eye view of all of this initially. And to be frank, a lot of the time we might notice that there are actually dysfunctional structures in place. Like, this team are expected to work together, but they never have a chance to meet and make decisions. So, of course, each person is going off on what they think should happen, and it's likely that in some situations they're going to have different ideas about what that is. So it's going to cause conflict. And one of the things that we can do to prevent that happening is changing the structure, moving people into different areas, clarifying the role interactions, going back to the data, etc. So really making sure that we've got the right structures in place would be the second thing to consider. At this stage, we don't even necessarily need to think about options, but during the analysis, we become aware of how are these factors contributing to the conflict that's going on. The third area is interests. This is where we start to think about what's important for either both of the people if it's two, or for the different people that are involved if it's a number of them. this is where we start to think about what's driving their behavior. Like, what do they want? And this might be things that they explicitly know that they want, or that they've said that they want. Like, this person thinks they should be team leader and they were acting in that role 12 months ago, but the decision was made at the time not to keep them there in a permanent capacity. So they want whatever comes along with the team leader. But what is that for them? Is it the recognition? Is it the dollars? Is it the autonomy? Is it that they want to make change because they've been affected by, inefficient processes before? Are they gearing up for a different role after that kind of thing? Like, does this factor into one step in their overall career plan? Like, what's driving them? If they want that role, how come? And then once we can become clear on the things that are important to the people that are involved, it might be that we can think through or even discuss with them options to meet those needs, even given or within the constraints that we might be dealing with. We could also think about the values that are involved here. This might be getting to know the people that are involved within the team, and what are the actual things that they strive for? What are the things that they hold on to? A lot of the time, this will be something like freedom, like I want autonomy, or I want input in decisions that affect me, or I want, to not feel like I'm being micromanaged or something like that. Or it will be to do with security, like I believe that we should give each other the benefit of the doubt or something like that, or I don't think that changes should be implemented without sufficient warning, something like that. And then the final layer to consider would be the relationship conflict. Now, this is often the tip of the iceberg. You see the interactions going on. One person refuses to say hello to somebody else, or maybe someone doesn't get back to someone. And so then the next time they ask for something, they notice that there's a delay in the response. And it is almost like this tit for tat type of thing that can sometimes develop. A lot of the time, the cause is actually a misunderstanding. That person might have been off sick, or they were under the pump with something else that week. So they did delay getting back to the person, but actually there was a good reason. But of course, the person receiving the email didn't know there was a reason. So what tends to happen is that people take it personally. It's an unfortunate type of bias that we have, that when something negative happens, we tend to assume that we are somehow involved, or sometimes the cause. So we think about those 5 factors: the data, structure, interest, values, and relationship types of conflict. You could write this down. You could discuss it as a leadership team if you work with a few other different people that are involved. And here we're starting probably to find that there are a number of options that begin to drop out of this reflection process. And from there, what we want to do is to develop a plan. And one of the ways that we can think about this is that there will almost be different stages of intervention. So at the beginning, I'm going to do this. If that doesn't work, I'll do this. Failing that, this is an option. If this happens to become available, then this is what I would like to do. So we're really starting to think about, like, I'm going to give this a go. And those initial phases probably will be the things that don't increase the sense of what's at stake. They don't require a lot of investment in terms of dollars and time from you. They're not likely to backfire in a massive way if they go wrong. So I'm going to just have a quick coffee with each person and get their take on the team in an informal kind of setting, for example. Because maybe I've realized that I don't actually have the data. I don't know what they're upset about. I can see the fact that they're upset. They seem very grumpy. They're rolling their eyes when each other are making comments, etc. But I don't know what's going on. Like, how long has this been a problem for? Were there particular triggers that caused it? Maybe there's other people involved that I'm not aware of, for example. So if I've decided that that's what I need to do, is a little bit of information gathering, then I might do it in a very low stakes way initially, like taking people out for coffee. Now, there's going to be some stakes. People are going to be aware that their team leader's trying to single each other out and take them out for coffee, etc. So there is a risk of negative fallout, but I think there's also a risk of negative fallout if you do nothing. So that, I think, is probably realistic, is that each option that you decide to go with is going to have different potential problems and different potential benefits. So what we need to do is almost like a cost-benefit analysis, where we go through option A, what are the potential problems, what are the potential benefits, etc. But I tend to find that erring on the side of the lowest potential problems early, the lowest potential risk, of course makes a lot of sense, because it keeps all of the rest of our options open. And if you've inherited a team and it's been a problem for 3 years, I sometimes wonder about the level of urgency that people have about that. Like sometimes I meet people for coaching and I'll say, well, look, what if you just give it a few weeks and do some observation? You know what I mean? Like you seem to think that you need to come in and solve the problem from the word go, but whatever gave you the idea that you'll be able to do that before you get to know what's happening here? Like even for you, if you're a high performer, you might have unrealistic expectations about the level of input or the level of influence that you might be able to have. So let's think about then, what are those lower level, lower stakes types of interventions, and then what would it look like to move towards the more assertive, the more higher stakes, the more pressurized type of options? Well, I mentioned at the beginning, data conflict is a helpful starting point in a lot of situations, and our approach there would be to clarify what's expected. So we could talk to people and say, look, when you're doing X, like when you're preparing these reports or when you're running this meeting or before you send this email, could you please do this? Or could you please stop doing this? Could you please stop making comments about your team leader's lack of experience? Could you please make sure that you're on time for these meetings or let us know if you're going to be late? Could you please make sure that you've read the agenda before we meet so that we're not going through things and, you know, you're taking time during the meeting to read what should have been preliminary background information? So of course it would depend on the situation, but what we want to do is to let them know what's expected. Can you please do this, or can you please stop doing this? This is how I understand the situation to be. This is what I think the two of you should be doing together. Have I got that right? Are there any problems with this from each of your perspectives, or is this still what you expect moving forward? So I could do this individually and meet them one-on-one, or I could meet them together. But the goal here is to make sure that we're all on the same page as much as possible. And there's, I guess, a double benefit here. Firstly, of course, we do want to prevent misunderstandings and ambiguity, etc., from coming up. But I actually think maybe the bigger benefit is that we hold people accountable because they've said what's expected in front of everybody. Everyone's heard me tell them the same thing, for example. So it doesn't leave as much wiggle room, maybe even just in terms of their heads and how they're thinking about their options for reneging on an agreement or not following through with what they've said that they were going to do. The next step might be thinking about the structure. This could be moving people apart, clarifying the role interactions. This could be about going back to the data as well and clarifying things like job descriptions, etc. But I think initially it's more to do with communication. I would suggest if your team is dysfunctional and communication's not working well, then you might put more effort than normal into communication, and that might follow through to the structure. So meet more frequently. And when you meet, you might, for example, ask somebody to share an example of their work, or you might prompt a discussion question like, could we look at this case study? Or I'd like to talk about how we're managing record keeping, or in terms of the deadlines that I've noticed that we've missed them a couple of times. Are they realistic? Is there anything that needs to change? Because the last thing I want is that we have an obligation that we've made, like a deadline, and then we're consistently not meeting it. It's not a good look for our department. I don't think that's going to reflect well on us when it comes time to, renegotiate budgets, whatever it is. So we really think about what's going to work best in terms of that structure. And then the next step might be thinking about the relationship conflict layer. The little narky comments, the rolling their eyes, the whinging and complaining and bitching about each other behind their back, all that kind of stuff. I think in terms of dealing with relationship conflict, the approach that's needed is a balance. And it's probably a balance between compassion or kindness, something in that end of you want to be a supportive manager, you can understand their perspective, you can see where they're coming from. But on the other side of the balance, on the other side of the scales is being firm and holding on to boundaries. And if somebody does the wrong thing, they need to know that there's a consequence for that. So one of the examples is that we should demonstrate empathy rather than sympathy. We might say something like, I can see how you might see things that way, and of course, that makes sense why this is your preference. At the same time, we expect staff to be doing this and this, like greeting each other in the morning or something. Respond when your team leader asks you to do something. So that's what I expect moving forward. So we do empathize. There is an element of that. I can see your perspective. I can see where you're coming from. That makes sense. But almost in the same breath, we say something like, and, or at the same time, or the challenge is that we're working towards a consistent way of approaching this, or we have this new policy that's been implemented, or the legislation's changed in our sector. Like, whatever the reason is that you decide to be firm, we can still do that. But of course, that will be received very differently when the person has a sense that you've listened to where they're coming from and that you validate and acknowledge their perspective as well. The fourth area that we could use, and this is still gradually ramping up that level of assertiveness in my mind, is thinking about interest conflict. And here we need to think about, what do they want? And as I mentioned, I think a lot of the time these interests actually come down to either I want freedom or I want security. Like when people want more money, I think that's often to do with security, or maybe it's freedom because they have more options in terms of their career choices, etc. And I've noticed that a lot of the negative behaviors that often come about as a result of workplace conflict are actually pushing back against encroachments in one of those areas, the freedom or security. When I feel micromanaged, it takes away my freedom, and I don't like that. When there's organizational change going on and no one knows whether or not they'll have to apply for their job, it challenges our security, and I don't like that. So one of the ways that we can deal with interest conflict is that we can think about, how can I help you, have a little bit more stability in your role, or have a little bit more flexibility, like whatever the side of it is that they're wanting, how can I help you have that despite these constraints, despite the fact that you've got a team leader in each shift, despite the fact that we're working with 12-month contracts due to the fact that this is how our organization is funded, or something like that. So we can still acknowledge it and say, I understand where you're coming from. You want this. You want to have more autonomy in your role, or you want to feel like you're developing your skill set and not stagnating, like whatever the thing is that's important to them. And then we discuss options for meeting that. But we need to decide how flexible we're willing to be. Sometimes we can be fully accommodating when we're dealing with interest conflict. Maybe the dysfunction within the team is because one person feels like they've been overlooked for training opportunities. So if we can talk to them about that and say, look, what would you like? What's important to you? What do you want, etc., then it might mean that we can think through options to give it to them and just be accommodating. When there's not much else at stake and they're an important staff member, then why not give them that to keep them happy? In other situations, if they're asking for something that's not realistic, or it's not helpful, or we just don't want to give it to them for whatever reason, then we're not that same accommodating type of approach. We take a competing approach where it's like, no, that's not something that I can approve. And so when we're dealing with interest conflict, it's not that either way is right or wrong. What you need to do is to consider strategically, well, how accommodating or how assertive should I be in this particular situation? What do they want and what do I want? And what are the potential options to help things move in that direction? And then the final level of conflict is values. And it's funny because I think this one could be the most pressurized, the most forceful, or the least, depending on how you dealt with it. But to me, I think using words like fair and professional, ask them to define, like, what do they think their contribution to a solution might be. If the communication were more respectful on their end, what would they be doing differently, that kind of thing. What's important to the other person? What would they notice you doing if you were listening to them? How consistently are you prepared to do that? What if you disagree with the decision that they make? What will you do then? Like, to me, I think when we really drill down to this, it's kind of like, well, are you prepared to do what your team leader's asking you to do or not? I know that you're unhappy about a decision that's made, and I think sometimes staff can get away with quite childlike behaviors because their managers don't stand up to themselves. It's like sometimes these values are subconsciously projected onto the manager or onto the team. I've heard of a lot of examples where staff members interrupt a meeting going on. They interrupt their manager or their team leader, and they say something like, well, I want to know what's happening with, the restructure, or something like that. Well, guess what? You don't always get what you want. And just because you want to know what's going on doesn't necessarily mean that I have to tell you. It is this childish type of response, almost like the toys out of the cot in a mini tantrum. And I think it's quite appropriate to push back on that and say, we are going to get to that topic, but this isn't the time. Well, I want to. I'm not listening to any more. And we could say, well, look, you can decide whether or not you're willing to stay. If you decide to leave, then we can talk about that later, and I'll need to consider, consequences for that. But this isn't your meeting. As the manager, I've set the agenda, and this is the order that we're going to discuss the topics. So it's just stating the facts. I'm the manager. I've made a decision about the structure. This is what it is, etc. And I think unless we realize that this is actually a conflict going on about values, like who's in charge or what level of autonomy should people have or what's appropriate, input and what's professional communication, etc. And we can deal with it at that level. Look, it sounds like you feel like there should be a bit of give and take. And it makes sense why you feel like because this is a significant issue, it should be prioritized. At the same time, I sent the agenda out last week. I asked for input and feedback at that stage, and you didn't send any reply. And so the decision has been made to use this structure today. So that's what we're going to follow. You can also use values to push back. There are 6 other people in the room who haven't had a chance to speak. If it's all right, could you please hold on to your additional thoughts? You have had a chance to share yours already. I'd like to hear from the other people who haven't had a chance yet. And then if we have time, I'd be happy maybe for you to add any additional thoughts at that stage. So this is the value. It's like, don't you realize these poor people haven't even had a chance to speak? We can even acknowledge sometimes a clash of value. It sounds like for you, being able to operate with autonomy is important or whatever it is. And part of the challenge is that we're now pushing towards more consistency across business units. And that means that you're changing processes and at times you're even using a less efficient version of a process that you might have used before. So it makes sense why this is probably quite frustrating for you in some of those situations. Having said that, given the fact that we're looking to scale, consistency is important, and so there's really no flexibility around some of those decisions that have been made. What I am prepared to discuss is this and this. Would you like to organise a time to do that? So we acknowledge both sides of the value. I understand that you think, whatever, your way works better, or because you're a local store, you should make local decisions. The challenge is that, we've been bought out by this company or we're looking at more consistency, etc. So this is how I'm going to deal with it. Either I do want to compromise or I don't, but I make that very transparent. And then if there is something left to discuss, some options to consider, I give them the choice. I would be prepared to discuss this area of the process. Is that something that you'd like to do? This, in a sense, gives them that sense of autonomy about the discussion and the conversation itself, as well as autonomy about the issue. Do you want to provide input or would you prefer just to leave it for now? And sometimes they don't want to discuss, it's like this thing just doesn't even make any difference to them and it's almost more insulting for them to get a token gesture on the other end. Sometimes people just want to feel like the victim and maybe that's just what you need to let them do in the short term. So how does this change happen? It's usually gradually. It's usually a combination of moving each of these different areas forward centimetre by centimetre or inch by inch as that larger ship of the big team slowly turns. But that doesn't mean that things can't be turned around. I've heard a number of success stories about effective managers being able to positively influence their team. It does sometimes, I think, take a little bit of a storming process. You might have heard that forming, storming, norming, performing type of stages of team develop previously, the Tuckman's ideas. So the storming has to happen. And if there's things that aren't working well, then the storming is probably going to be quite important, but probably also quite stressful. So I hope that that's been helpful for you, thinking through some options for dealing with those situations where you inherit a dysfunctional team. If it has been helpful, I would be incredibly grateful if you would leave a positive review. Just consider leaving 5 stars in Apple or Spotify in particular, or whichever the podcast platform is that you listen on. If you'd be willing to write a sentence or two, that's a gigantic cue to the algorithm that this is helpful content that other people might find useful. And otherwise, all the best. I do hope that you have some success managing the dysfunctional teams if that's the situation that you're in, or even if it's a situation that you might be in down the track. I hope that it's helpful in terms of some preemptive analysis potentially. Thank you very much for listening and bye for now.